Recording unpaused. And per usual with my style, we're going to stop with just some breathing and reflecting. So you can close your eyes, you can take a soft gaze, you can just like sit and listen. But the purpose is just to kind of like come into this space together. And I'm actually going to turn off my video too because, oh no, I'm not. I'm going to leave it on because that is the better thing to do. Okay, so go ahead and just, again, close your eyes, take a soft gaze. Maybe focus on a color in front of you or whatever you want to do. And just bring your attention to your breathing. And just take a couple deep breaths in and out. If it feels good, just giving yourself a chance to slow it down a little bit. Maybe breathing into the count of 4 and then out to the count of 4 a couple times. And I'm just going to ask you a series of questions and you can just pay attention to whatever comes. Where in your body does your where in your body does your intuition live? What does that feel like? Does that place of your intuitive knowing have a quality? Where does truth live in your body? Maybe that's the same spot, maybe not. What about your imagination? And maybe this is a trick question, maybe not, but where does mind live in your body? Do you feel a sense of connection between any of these things? Intuition, truth, imagination, mind. Again, just noticing. You can go ahead and let that process go and just come back to your breathing. And we'll go ahead and get started with the lecture time. And yes, I will always gripe about Zoom. I always mean not to, but then I run into problems. You would think I would know at this point in time. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Okay, so welcome. Welcome to my little lecture about Neptune square the nodes and discerning truth. I ended up going down a lot of research rabbit holes for this, like so many. And so I'm trying to, whittle it down to metabolizable pieces. And so since I have to whittle it down, I'm just going to talk about Neptune and Pisces squaring the lunar nodes and how we can see this, current collective transit in heavy quotes phenomenon of conspirituality. So we'll be talking about those kind of core archetypes, what Neptune is, what the lunar nodes are. We'll talk about conspirituality. Before we do that, a couple things to note, just logistically speaking. I will probably ask if there's any questions a copious amount of times. But if you are really kind of like thinking about something and want to interrupt me, please feel free. I probably won't track chat except for when I pause to ask for questions. So if you need to interrupt me, it's usually better if you can unmute yourself. And so one thing I like to do before I launch in, is just give you some information about my lens, my biases, who my teachers are and things like that, so that you understand kind of like, where my worldview is coming from, and what my biases might be, because it's always important to bring in that discernment thing, which is actually a big piece of what we'll be talking about tonight. So my identity is I am a queer, mixed race, non-monogamous person with chronic illness. I identify as a healing arts practitioner, an astrologer, and a soul worker. I am the descendant of Mexican, Maya, Spanish, Lebanese, Swedish, and Swiss ancestors. I lived in a very low-income household until my dad died when I was 6, at which point life insurance afforded us the opportunity to move to pretty affluent white suburbia. So I spent the rest of my childhood in that setting in a single parent household. My core astrological teachers, so the ones that I have worked with the most one-on-one, are Patricia Walsh, Mark Jones, Stephen Forrest, and then Randy Morris was my main mentor in grad school. And so in grad school, I did focus on depth psychology and how apocalyptic imagery affects the psyche. And I brought evolutionary astrology into the mix with that. So I have a pretty depth-oriented focus. I tend to want to go like into somatic processes and understand what's going on beneath the surface of things. Patricia Walsh would say that I have apocalypse consciousness. Maybe I do. Not that I think the world is always ending, but just that I can see a lot of crisis in the world. And so I'm very invested in using astrology as a tool to help people understand how to deal with their most entrenched patterns, with trauma. So I do bring theories of trauma into a lot of the work that I do, and you'll see a lot of that in play for this lecture. And so my astrological focus is evolutionary, psychological, archetypal, embodied, and experiential astrologies. And so because of that, I think a lot of those are very psychological. I'm not going to focus a lot on technique. Well, maybe a little bit. But that does include using modern rulerships. And so from the perspective of this lecture, when we talk about Neptune, it is very strong in the sign of Pisces because that is the sign that it rules. Any questions about any of that? And so I'll probably ramble for an hour-ish, and then we'll take a little break, mostly because my back is not having me sitting as much as I am. So getting up and just like wiggling around for 5 minutes is helpful to me. I'll come back and talk some more, and then we will have room for conversation, questions, or anything that kind of comes up by the end of the lecture. Okay. So the intentions of this lecture, I know I need to adjust my little screens here if I can. Nope. Hold, please. Okay. Intentions. To explore how we can see planetary archetypes at play in the collective and use this to deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world based on one specific snapshot. All right, so this is just going with the premise that astrology really works on a system of observation correlation, right? I'm observing things that happen in the world, and then I'm correlating with it. I'm correlating it with my experience, what I know to be true. And so you're kind of like, making connections that way. It's all about correspondences. And so because the archetypes are so vast, a really great way to get to know the depths of what they represent or the vastness of what they represent is to identify them in the world around you. Intention number 2 is to elucidate mainstream memes and viral themes. I didn't mean to rhyme, but that's lovely. Such as disinformation, conspirituality, fake news, using the astrological lens, and whip up some curiosity in the process. That's the Gemini North Node, one of the Gemini North Node portions of our talk. To familiarize, did I even spell that right? Familiarize you with some basic principles of evolutionary astrology and how they can be worked with at the personal level using collective transit. So again, we're not going to talk about natal astrology. We're talking about transit astrology or collective astrology. I guess in some ways that would be called mundane astrology. So that's what's going on right now. Now that is applicable in that you can locate where these transiting planets are in your chart, and we'll talk a tiny bit about that, but generally speaking, we're talking about the world. We're way zoomed out for this talk. We're also just gonna, this is just an opportunity to practice using the astrological language because Gemini, again. And a lot of times, I I say this kind of jokingly, I'm like half joking with astrology and tarot. Sometimes I feel like they just give us a good excuse to have conversations about real things. Right? And so that's another piece of this. And you'll even get to see in some of the charts that I threw in here that we'll be looking at, just unformed thoughts that I have, like some of the rabbit holes that I went down that I was like, ooh, something's going on there, but I don't quite know what it is, right? So again, that process of just drawing connections. All right, so content warnings. I will be talking a little bit about New Age spirituality. New Age spirituality does very much have some racist and white supremacist undertones in it, overtones. Keeping in mind that, some of my spirituality is informed by things that would be called New Age, and yours might be too, right? Like I'm sitting here holding a piece of amethyst. So, right, there's nuance in a lot of these things. COVID, I won't explicitly really be talking about COVID, just in that a lot of the conspiracy theories that have been conflated into conspirituality and through QAnon have some COVID elements to them. QAnon itself, we won't be talking about pedophilia or like what it is, but because that is a basic premise of the QAnon conspiracy theory, I will be mentioning it. And also white supremacy is embedded in that one as well. And then conspirituality itself, because it's including the content I've already mentioned. Any questions about that? And there is, I will be talking again very briefly about just colonial trauma, right? So anyone living under this system has experienced a fairly significant amount of trauma, some folks more than others. And so I do need to say, in terms of like adding to the biases portion, I think QAnon is a problematic thing at best, right? That is a bias that I hold. And I'm not gonna harp on that in this. But that is definitely part of my lens, is that I think that these things are problematic and really harmful as well. And so with that, let's just kind of talk about the basics, whittling it way, 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 way down, of evolutionary astrology. So evolutionary astrology is primarily associated with Stephen Forrest and Jeff Green as being kind of like the, progenitors, like the initial people who brought these systems into the world. Their versions of evolutionary astrology are a little bit different, and I won't get into the mechanics of that, but I will just say that I trained with Stephen Forrest, so I clearly have that going on. But at this point in my practice, I align more closely with Jeff Green's style of evolutionary astrology, specifically as practiced by Patricia Walsh and Mark Jones. So EA views astrology as a way of understanding evolutionary processes from collective and individual points of view. So again, our focus tonight is on the collective. And so when we're talking about collective transits from the EA perspective, we're talking at least a little bit about trauma, right? And the outer planets in evolutionary astrology, including Saturn, so Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, are all describing different kinds of trauma. EA focuses on Pluto, which is kind of like the baseline in the chart, or the deeply unconscious patterns from which the rest of the chart kind of emerges. And the nodes of the moon, which represent the patterns and karmas just at a little less deep level. They're a little easier to kind of access. So it focuses on Pluto and the nodes of the moon as a way to understand core wounds and ways to work with karmic material and entrenched patterns. So for our purposes, you can think of the south node as being like a release valve. It's emptying. It's where we're trying to heal some shadow material. And then the north node is something to be developed. And so it's something that can be intentionally worked with. And so we'll mostly be ignoring Pluto for this talk tonight. So basic ideas about the lunar nodes, again, very generally speaking. The lunar nodes are currently in Gemini and Sagittarius. So the north node, which is the symbol on the left, is in Gemini, and the south node, which is the symbol on the right, is in Sagittarius. And the south node is about healing shadow distortions of that archetype. And we'll break this all down. And then the north node is about bringing in that archetype. So south node in Sagittarius is about healing shadow distortions of Sagittarius. North node in Gemini is about activating and consciously intending to connect with the Gemini archetype. And so we're thinking about the nodes as being on a polarity, right? They always exist exactly 180 degrees from each other. And so it is about balancing the opposites, or the tension of the opposites, or the paradoxes that are created when we find ourselves in the midst, or when we find ourselves in a heavily emphasized polarity. So the nodes spend about 18 months in a pair of signs. The nodes entered Gemini and Sag in May of 2020. They'll be there through the end of this year, and then switching, I can't remember if it's January or February of 2022. So technicalities, I'm using porphyry house systems, which won't matter as much because we're talking about collective transits. The house systems, when we look at charts, or excuse me, the house placements, when we look at charts, won't be as relevant, but EA in general does either use porphyry or placidus. We're using modern rulerships, as I said. And I'm not using exact times for the charts that we'll look at. It was hard to find them. In fact, for some charts, I just picked, a date in the middle of the year. As long as I was sure that like the nodes were in the same sign for the whole year, we know that Pluto or Neptune's going to be in the same sign for the whole year. So I'm just getting the general placements. And so houses, not super important. It's just a technicality of the EA system. And so when we're talking about Neptune square the nodes, this is actually something that was in effect for all of last year. It really amped up in the last half of last year. And it was at its exact square on January 26th of this year. So at this point in time, it's starting to separate, right? The energy has built and climaxed and it's starting to ebb off again. Any questions? Okay. So the South Node in Sagittarius. Right. Building that up a little bit more. Again, the South Node, I think it's helpful to think of it like in the Vedic or traditional sense, where it's something that we're full of, and so we're trying to release it. It's trying to empty, right? So because we're just talking about collective transits, I'm not going to focus on the positive aspects, but I'm just going to say, collectively speaking, with the South Node in Sagittarius, we have opportunities to heal or release wounds that are related to belief. So shadow side would be, the shadow side of religion, like fundamentalism, right? Like that very, very, clinging on to a belief. Even when it, stops matching up with your experience, oftentimes it's a survival mechanism. So fundamentalism, you see that in like the Crusades. It has that crusader energy. There's many different images of that have happened in the past year, right? Where belief and ideology are kind of taking control. And we know that belief and religion have been the cause of a lot of collective trauma, right? And so one way of thinking about this is that those specific wounds can be really active in the collective right now. Healing, releasing wounds related to trust and intuition. I mean, that can't be over exaggerated. So many of us have really deep wounds around not being able to trust our intuition, right? For the various ways it's kind of been badgered out of us. Wounds around mythology, and like what I think about, what I mean there is things like, family mythology. We Smiths always think positive. Like you see this a lot actually with Donald Trump. He has a South Node in Sagittarius, and it was instilled at him at an early age by his father. Not that they always look at the positive side of things, but like, I mean, that's what it was essentially, like look at the positive side of things, but it has become inflated at this point to where when people would bring Trump news about coronavirus, for example, he would say to them, don't come back to me with this bad news. I only want to hear the positive. Right. So that starts to lead into themes of like spiritual bypassing that we'll talk about. And, that way that people have that can be this like, like la 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 la, I can't hear you if you're not telling me what I want to hear. Wounds related to gurus and teachers, false prophets, wounds related to indoctrination. So we start to get into kind of like cult dynamics here, with Sagittarius being more about the belief of the cults, whereas Aquarius is more about the structure or the system of the cult. And then loss of innocence, which kind of links back into that trust and intuition bullet point. So then the North Node in Gemini, again, this is like what is the medicine? What is the way to balance those things? Curiosity, learning. Like when things really started getting intense with the pandemic. So we're thinking, March, April, May of last year. And I knew that the nodes were about to switch. And there were all these viral memes going on. This is another, theme of Neptune square the nodes. Viral memes that are going around about trauma. Right. And so it's the difference between like reading a meme about trauma and being like, oh my God, that's me. Oh my God, I identify with this. Wah! Versus being like, hey, I think that this might be going on with me. So I'm going to learn some more about it before I adopt it. Right. I'm going to engage that Gemini part of like, hey, what does this mean? And what are the definitions? And how do I engage with this with curiosity? Dialogue versus debate. Right? Dialogue is more the Gemini part of the polarity versus debate, which is the Sagittarian part. Like, I know the truth and I'm going to tell you what the truth is. Versus dialogue, which involves that listening function. New ways of knowing. And bringing in new narratives, which, gets back into that mythology thing. Okay, gross oversimplifications, but any questions?
I have a question, curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking a lot about, on this axis of Gemini and Sag, school trauma and how much trauma is happening now because of online school.
Mm-hmm.
But that possibly, I don't know, just themes around that and needing innovation.
Yeah, totally. That's a very good point. And I think that we'll see that we'll bring that in more when we talk about what Neptune squaring the nodes actually does.
Cool.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Let's talk about Neptune a little bit. Neptune's been in Pisces since 2011. Slow moving planet, spends forever in a sign. It will be moving into Aries for the first time in 2025, and then it will dip back into Pisces and then move into Aries for 20 years or whatever it is in 2026. So Neptune is a force of dissolution, disillusionment, inspiration, illusion, imagination, fantasy, escapism, boundary blurring, disintegration, confusion, glamour, sacrifice, transcendence, ecstasy, spirituality, and addiction, to name a few. It's associated with the urge to transcend, to get lost in, to bewitch. In EA, it's associated with diffusive trauma / dissociative trauma / spiritual trauma. And so again, if I'm just bringing, in concrete examples, this can be the horrors that, indigenous cultures in America faced, on this land faced, when settlers came in, right? Like, you're living a life one way, and then all of a sudden this horror nightmare happens, and it's like, I get broken open, right? The container that holds my sense of identity is gone because the shock is so much. That can also be, many other traumas that have been caused by organized religion, but it could also be, having alcoholism in the family, right? Or a psychotic episode. So in that sense, Neptune can also be associated with profound spiritual healing, right? So we think of Neptune as being diffusive trauma at that spiritual level, Pluto as being more of the emotional, psychological trauma or component of trauma. Uranus is mental trauma. And then Saturn is physical. Obviously, they all kind of overlap. But to talk about things, it's usually helpful to kind of break them down. So one thing that I feel really drawn to just kind of like fleshing out a little bit more, for whatever reason, at the intuitive level, is that when we're talking about Neptune being a force of fantasy, this is a really important component. And actually, maybe it is in a slide. Hold up a sec. Well, okay. I'll talk about it now, and if it comes up later, so be it. Neptune, its association with fantasy, is a really important thing to understand, because what will happen is that, like, if you imagine, you know, sometimes people with a lot of Neptune in their chart or a lot of Pisces in their chart, especially when it involves the karmic parts of their chart, so Pluto, the nodes of the moon, the rulers of the nodes of the moon, it's almost as if the soul, the person, is like standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, and they're ready to dive into the next experience, but they can't tell how deep the ocean is. They can't tell how far away the horizon is. They can't tell what the temperature is. And so there's a sense of existential fear. And so the person is, really reliant on the ground that they're standing on, because it's something they can identify. It's something that's holding them. And they're feeling this kind of soul level call to change, right? To release and let go and become the new thing. You can think of this also in terms of the circle, the wheel of the zodiac, and Pisces emerging into Aries, into the new birth, into the new experience. And so what'll happen sometimes is that people will cling to their ego identity past the point when it's supposed to change, or they will cling to the fantasy of what a relationship is, or they will claim to the fantasy of who they are if they associate with a religion or a belief system or an ideology, because that feels like it keeps them safe from the terror of the unknown. That feels like it keeps them safe from the existential crisis that comes when a belief, when a fantasy gets shattered. And this is part of the dynamic that we're working with at the collective level when we're talking about things like QAnon and conspirituality, because what happens when the prophecy doesn't come true? What happens when the idol falls? So in Pisces, the primary focus of Neptune is to bridge between the ego, the separated consciousness, and the higher forces of life in their totality. In that, there is a need to understand the phenomenon of the ego, the way we personalize our life. Another quote: in Pisces, Neptune aspires to total merging, a return to the source, and the danger lies in being unable to distinguish between escapism and true spiritual inspiration. It gets hard to discern Pisces, opposite of Virgo, right? Everything is one in the ocean. There's no differentiation. It's hard to tell one thing from another. Questions about that? Okay. So a specific thing happens when a planet is squaring the nodes of the moon. And it's like that planet that is squaring the nodes of the moon gets really emphasized and underscored in the collective. There's a lot of focus that goes there, especially when it's one of the slow movers, right? So Saturn to some extent, but definitely Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. A fundamental issue arises with the nodes of the moon when planets square that axis. This kind of planetary placement represents a core issue that has been thus far unresolved, a skipped step in the process of moving from the patterns described by the south node of the moon towards the intention symbolized by the north node of the moon. The planet in square represents the issues that can interrupt the progression of development. So again, in this kind of like very linear reality, which most of us don't exist in, we're going from the north node to the south node. It's like, hey, I'm letting go of my Sagittarian wounding and I'm inviting in curiosity and learning and dialogue and all of those things, right? Again, to balance the polarity. So when a planet squares the nodes, what happens is that there can be this kind of flip-flop dynamic, right? So on the progression from the south node to the north node, something happens that triggers the core complexes in the planet that squares it. So Neptune, we have, escapism or disillusionment or despair or existential crisis. And then, it's all that emotional stuff wells up. I'm going to fall back into my beliefs, right? I'm going to fall back into following the guru. I'm going to fall back into the south node, because the south node represents a point of familiarity. So it's this idea that, like, even if our patterns are harmful to us, they're also the known, right? And so there's comfort in the known versus like this thing over here where like I don't really know. Again, I've got my polarity going. There's this thing over here going on and I don't know what happens if I move to that. And so, when the material represented by the planet squaring the nodes is constellated or brought up, there's that tendency to just kind of fall back into the patterns. So when Neptune is square the moon's nodes, the unresolved material pertains to the subtle issues of one's sense of ultimate meaning, one's dreams and ideals. The skipped step can therefore revolve around the loss of meaning, profound disillusionment or despair that leads to loss of life force and will. The necessary discrimination required here is difficult to attain because there's a struggle to clarify the difference between personal fantasy and objective reality. I'm going to read that paragraph again. The necessary discrimination required here is difficult to attain because there's a struggle to clarify the difference between personal fantasy and objective reality. That really does a lot of summing it up of at least part of our situation right now. Okay. So one way of thinking about this, another way of thinking about this, is that when a planet is squaring the nodes, we're dealing with the whole cross of that modality, right? So here we're dealing with the whole mutable cross. And one way of working with a planet squaring the nodes is, at least it's simple to say, as simple as, what are the healthy expressions of all of the archetypes and what are the shadow expressions of all of the archetypes, and how can I build my awareness of them? Because what'll happen is that the north node in this flip-flop process, the north node will start to take on qualities of the south node, and the south node will start to take on qualities of the north node, right? It becomes less clear. And so it's like, okay, how do I get to know positive and negative expressions of these archetypes and then recognize them in myself and work with them that way? Hey, I should have deleted one of those images. I'm not sure which one. Super. Okay. So we're talking about a planet squaring the nodes as representing a core emotion, right? And so because we're talking about collective astrology, it's a little bit trickier to talk about that because there's going to be a lot of core emotions for different people. This is really an individual thing, right? But for example, a core emotion in a Neptune nodal square can be disillusionment. So creating a reality around something that we project ultimate meaning upon, and the process that happens when we see the truth or reality of what the thing actually is. So this process of the lifting of the veil. One of my go-to books on Neptune is by Maurice Fernandez, and the subtitle is The End of Hope, the Beginning of Truth. right? And Maurice Fernandez puts that in terms of like he associates Aquarius with hope, and then in the progression to Pisces we get to truth. But I would actually say that that's really indicative of the square between Sagittarius and Pisces, with Sagittarius as emerging from Scorpio being like, whoa, there's the light again, there's hope. And then the square dynamic is that kind of like the crisis that comes when the veil is lifted and I see the reality of how things are, and that disillusionment process. Another core emotion, not necessarily different from disillusionment, is despair. So we're talking about like the depths of grief. And then another core emotion can be empathy. I don't know. I'm kind of questioning myself on placing this in that context, because I don't know that I consider empathy to be an emotion. I wonder what I was thinking when I put this here. Well, in any case, hashtag positive reframe. I guess one of the healing sides of a Neptune nodal square is the development of empathy. And that really can be seen as the integration of the full mutable cross, which we'll talk about next. But understanding the emotional realities of others and responding compassionately, and including the Virgo polarity, which offers discernment and boundaries to that compassion. So because we're dealing with 3 of the 4 signs in the mutable cross in their healthy and shadow expressions, let's just take a look at those themes. Lots of words. Where am I on time? Let's see. I have to exit out to look at my clock. Okay. Great. So Gemini. And so what I would ask you to do here, right? Like maybe it's an overwhelming amount of words, but I've tried to bold some of the themes that we're going to see as we keep talking. Like we'll see all of these, but again, it's just kind of like scanning over them to see, so that you can kind of hold them in your mind, so that as we talk about conspirituality, you'll hear the themes. So Gemini, communication, that can be wounds around persecution because of being the messenger, inability to communicate, inability to deliver the message. So that can be just like, I can't speak, right? There's a fear around it. Oftentimes when we say wounds, we're talking about phobias or, heavy quotes, irrational fears. Intellect. So wounds around that can be limitations in knowledge and learning, overemphasized head at the expense of the heart, needing to know everything, compulsive knowledge seeking. I mean, to me, this is just like scrolling or going down, YouTube rabbit holes. Opinions. So wounded expression or wounds around that can be believing everything, oversaturation with information. Holy wow, I get that one a lot. And then cynicism that comes. Oriented towards facts and information can lead to or be associated with inability to synthesize, doubting intuition. Changeability can be a positive form of Gemini. Wounded form can be instability, nervous disorders, overly flexible, or scattered. Like, I can see all sides of the situation, so I can never make a decision, right? How can I make a decision when I can see all the different ways, all the different perspectives? Duality, the ability to see opposites. So here we have psychological splitting and compartmentalization. And then Gemini can be very clever, but it is also associated with lying, lies, and deceitfulness. So then Saggy, we have very first philosophical. So they can be wounds related to being out of touch with reality, living in ideas, over abstractions, and fundamentalist ideologies. Strong Sag, heck yeah, such an ability to be in touch with beliefs and truth and intuition. So then again, that shadow side of that can be dogmatic, deceitful, half-truths, over-opinionated, fundamentalist, crusader energy, as I already spoke about. Saggy is very inspirational. Wounded can be deluded or charmed. Again, it's kind of like a La La Land feel to it. Higher learning, can be associated with misuse of knowledge or gullibility with teachers and gurus. Trusting, wounds to trust, naivete, opinions, overly opinionated, stubborn beliefs, vision quest, indoctrination, optimistic. Here we get spiritual bypassing or an ethos of just look on the bright side. I guess that would be the example there. Virgo. Virgo's very service oriented. So then shadow can be servant, slave, inequality, self-sacrifice complex. And I'm using the word complex. These lists are adapted from Patricia Walsh's book, Understanding Karmic Complexes, which is one of my favorite astrology books ever. She takes case studies of clients, and so that there are her client charts in the book, and she tells you about their past life stories. So you can see how the past life stories elucidate the themes of Pluto and the nodes. Humility. So we have inferiority, humiliation, shame, apprenticeship, wounds to being in one's own power, orderly, crisis-oriented, addicted to crisis, panic, and details, discriminating. So that can be hypercritical or a persecution complex, like an I'm afraid they're going to judge me, I'm afraid they're going to get me type of complex. Virgo is associated with health, very good on the mind-body connection thing. So wounded forms of that can be nervous compulsions, neurosis, anxiety disorders. And then we have Pisces. So Pisces can be very trusting. So shadow side of that is going to be wounds to trust, very similar to Sag, misplaced touch, naivete. Where Libra has to do with how we project onto other people, Pisces has to do with how we project divinity and our relationship with the divine. So that's what that projection of divinity, or, you know, putting lovers on pedestals, right? Putting rose-colored glasses on. Mystical, that can be associated with the shock caused by exposure to reality or an ability to be in the world. Glamour, magic, spiritual bypassing again. Pisces can be very innocent. So then there's loss of innocence, wounds to innocence, folly. Transcendent, so avoidant, dissociative, have an erosion of sense of self. That's that kind of attachment to fantasy that I was talking about. Imaginative, so clinging to fantasy, disbelief, denial, disillusionment. Delusional. Unconscious. And so in the positive side, they're like the collective unconscious, right? Like being connected to oneness, being connected to compassion. That can also be related to, you know, the dream world. So then the wounded expression of that can be taken over by, or being a victim to, or being lost in. So we get insanity there. And then connected to the collective. I guess that's kind of what I just talked about, but lost or lack of identity, mirroring others, being projected onto. Creation of victim of chaos. I'm not entirely sure what that meant, but so it goes. Questions?
Can you say a little bit more about Virgo and crisis? Like, why is, yeah.
Yeah. The best way to explain that to me is, so thinking about astrology as a developmental wheel, and we start with Aries, the birth instinct, and then Taurus is, you know, being held and developing our sense of sensory safety and having our survival needs met, and then Gemini's, you know, the development of the conscious mind and learning about things and talking about things and categorizing, and then Cancer is the development of the personal ego and association with the family identity, and then Leo is the expression of that ego identity. So the first 5 signs are all subjective. 5 out of 12. It's a lot of inward focus. And then we know Libra through Pisces is all about interpersonal dynamics and then transpersonal dynamics. So Virgo holds the pressure of moving from how can I be special to how can I be useful. And it's associated with humility, but oftentimes it's kind of like this crucible of pressure that becomes humiliation. You can also think about it as again, natural zodiac. The relationship between Aries and Virgo is an inconjunct, which is an aspect of crisis because it's two things that can't see each other. There's no way to relate. They don't share a modality. They don't share an element. So they don't know how to get along. And so Virgo carries a lot of that crisis orientation because it is that kind of pressure cooker. And when you're in a pressure cooker, usually then there's a explosion of some kind. Does that help?
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Anything else? All right, where am I? More words just to kind of summarize themes, karmic themes of the mutable cross / themes that we'll be talking about. Did I leave that one in? No. Okay. Persecution, martyrdom, victim savior complexes, self-sacrifice, cognitive dissonance. That's a big one. Conspiracy itself, existential crisis and despair, seeing the ideal instead of the real, selective reasoning, finding tidbits of info that support beliefs, charismatic leaders, and contagion. And so contagion is most closely associated with Neptune and Pisces. And we're talking about emotional contagion, viral contagion, psychic contagion. Right? So obviously we currently have a virus at play, quite literally. But you can also see emotional contagion a lot in social media or through the media in general. And psychic contagion is not something that I'm planning on talking about a lot, but probably a point for further contemplation if that's interesting to you. So now we have our themes and our words and our basic framework. So what I'd like to do is just take a little 5-minute break. It's 7:28, so we'll say till 7:35, and then come back and we'll start looking at charts. Okay. Okay. All right, so are there any questions or out loud processings that need to happen at this point? Ponderings. Okay. Share screen. Oh. Okay. So what we're going to do now is just kind of build a framework for talking about conspirituality and disinformation and fake news and all of that. So I would say just kind of pay attention to the ways that you hear the themes that we just talked about coming through. And to introduce this part of the lecture, I'm going to start with just showing you some charts. I found so many charts that were so interesting. And I'm really just looking at the presence of the nodes on the Gemini Sagittarius axis, occasionally the Pisces Virgo axis, and then what Neptune was up to, although, it's not totally consistent, but, keeping in mind that the nodes of the moon are going to be in a mutable sign approximately every 4 or 6 years. So, it's not a super rare thing, but we're just looking at a pattern. We're seeing echoes. I'm not, gonna really even try to interpret like what it means. I just am interested in sharing the patterns. All right, so first chart. Well, Zoom screen's in the way. Hold, please. It's because I'm really stubborn about like keeping it on gallery view so that I can see as many faces as possible. Okay. All right, so this is the chart for, sorry. Can you go over here? Oh, thank you. All right. So disinformation is a loan translation word from Russian. And so a loan translation is where they just translate the word piece by piece. So it's quite literal. So disinformation is a translation from the word desinformatia from Russian. So disinformation is actually a thing that, as far as we know, originated in Russia in or around 1923. And it was defined in the Soviet Encyclopedia, sorry about the typo there, the Soviet Encyclopedia of 1952 as false information with the intention to deceive public opinions. It is associated with deliberate falsehoods. And it is from the title of a Russian black propaganda department. So black propaganda was a form of propaganda, or is a form of propaganda, that's intended to create the impression that it was created by those it is supposed to discredit. It contrasts with gray propaganda, which does not identify its source, and white propaganda, which does not disguise its origins. It's typically used to vilify or embarrass the enemy through misrepresentation. So this is the chart for around the time the word was first used. Again, it was sometime in 1923, so I just kind of chose the middle of the year, but the nodes would have been in Virgo Pisces that whole year. So we've got that mutable axis. That's about all we can tell from there, is that there's the mutable axis going on with the chart, because that square from Sun and Mercury We don't know. Could have been there, could have not. All right. So this is a chart for a newspaper called The Patriot. And this was a newspaper that was set up by the KGB for the sheer purpose of publishing disinformation. And it set the groundwork for a later chart that we're going to look at. So this is 1962. I tried to find an exact date for this one, but to no avail. But what you'll notice here is that we have that square to the nodes. So they're not on the, we have that square from Neptune to the nodes. So they're not on the mutable axis. But that square would have been in effect for most of the year. All right, so we still get those kind of core Neptunian themes coming up. Not totally inconsequential that Pluto and Jupiter, Chiron, are on the mutable axis there. But again, I haven't delved that far into this to kind of get into the nitty gritty of it. So this is a chart for Operation Infection. This was a Soviet disinformation campaign to influence opinion that the US invented AIDS. And so in July of 1983, a well-known American scientist and anthropologist, it wasn't really, wrote a letter claiming that AIDS was manufactured at Fort Detrick by genetic engineers as a result of attempts to develop bioweapons. So you see here, again, nodal axis. This was definitely in July. I couldn't get the exact date in July, but we see Neptune conjunct the south node of the moon in Sagittarius. And so this was, to say it was problematic is an understatement. The KGB did admit in 1992 that it was behind the newspaper article, but by that point, 15% of Americans considered it probable that AIDS was created in a lab. And at the time when the KGB admitted that in 1992, the nodes did switch into Gemini and Sag that year, about halfway through the year, so might or might not be relevant. It's hard to tell. But again, you see that activation of the mutable axis going on. Another thing that I thought was interesting was that October 24th of 1964, Marshall McLuhan published a book called Understanding Media. And Marshall McLuhan is actually somebody who's thinking on the nature of media and its probable eventual impact on the interior world of humans and the private lives of humans. Is really profound. So it's heavily philosophical stuff, but highly relevant to right now. And he talked about photography in general and technology in particular as having a potentially virulent nature. And this seems to be the first time that there is the mention of the media being able to go viral. So it's the first time that that term is used in association with anything other than, like, you know, viruses. So we see the nodes in a similar place again as they are now, except with Pluto square instead of Neptune, Pluto and Uranus, and then Chiron on the other side. So bringing it a little bit more current, we have fake news. And so the information that I could find on that was that fake news pretty much originated in the summer of 2016. And the specific instance that it's credited coming from is when BuzzFeed's media editor noticed a stream of made-up stories that seemed to come out of a town in Macedonia. And they ID'd 140 fake news websites, pulling in huge numbers on Facebook. But the city was getting rich from it because of Facebook advertising algorithms. And so it was really hard to shut it down because it just kept proliferating. So there were headlines like Pope Francis shocks the world, endorses Donald Trump for president, or FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leak found dead in apparent murder-suicide. So with this kind of coining of fake news, again, we see that heavy mutable axis emphasis. And Neptune's in the mix as well, right? Neptune conjunct the South Node. And then there's a square from Saturn that's exact. And in 2016, I don't think this is too much of a tangent. In 2016, Saturn and Neptune were square each other for the whole year. And one of the many ways of looking at that square is that it can be difficult to tell reality from fantasy, right? So think of it just basic square. There's a clash between fantasy, Neptune, and reality, Saturn. And I actually remember being at a conference that year, and Lynn Bell was giving a lecture about the Saturn-Neptune square. And she said that it is a time when she's always so eloquent. She said it way more eloquently than I, but she said it's a time when like the nightmares of the masses, like the worst case scenarios of the masses, or the dreams of the masses take on gravity and can come into form through Saturn. And in that instant, I was like, oh, Trump's gonna win. This was in like May of that year. And so we'll see this Neptune conjunct the South Node, Saturn square in at least the next chart, if not more. And so we see, again, fake news, disinformation, viral spreading, all showing up in these kind of formative charts of the ideas, or at least when they come into mass awareness or purposeful use. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. So I'm just going to touch lightly on QAnon. So QAnon's relevant to our discussion because it pretty much encompasses the extreme right-wing conspiracy theories that make up the conspirituality thing. So, working definition of conspirituality, which we'll get to a more eloquent one later, but it is the conflation of alt-right conspiracy theories with the alternative health and wellness movement. So from an article in The Atlantic, it says that QAnon is a movement united in mass rejection of reason, objectivity, and other Enlightenment values. The group harnesses paranoia to fervent hope and a deep sense of belonging. To look at QAnon is to see not just a conspiracy theory, but the birth of a new religion. And in that article, they say that they believe it's on its way to becoming a religion a la the Seventh-day Adventists or the Church of Latter-day Saints, which are the two other kind of like big American religions, right? So mass rejection of reason and objectivity, that's somewhat mutable cross. They also talk a lot about how it seems to be creating crusaders. So we get that Sagittarius shadow in there as well. So QAnon holds Donald Trump as a deity-like figure, secretly battling a deep state cabal of pedophiles who control the government. And they are also harvesting children's brains so that they can eat them and attain eternal youth. Ugh. Okay. So I'm just going to read a quote. In its broadest contours, the QAnon belief system looks something like this. Q is an intelligence or military insider with proof that corrupt world leaders are secretly torturing children all over the world. They're embedded in a deep state. Donald Trump is working tirelessly to thwart them. The eventual destruction of the global cabal is imminent, Q prophesies, but can be accomplished only with the support of patriots who search for meaning in Q's clues. To believe Q requires rejecting mainstream institutions, ignoring government officials, battling apostates, and despising the press. One of Q's favorite rallying cries is, "You are the news now." Another is, "Enjoy the show," a phrase that his disciples regard as reference to a coming apocalypse. When the world as we know it comes to an end, everyone's a spectator. Okay. So if there is a birth date to QAnon, you can go based on one of two things, really. One is the first Q drop, which is what when QAnon comes out with the posts or whatever it is. But the other is actually a shooting that happens in a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., when a man who otherwise had a pretty ordinary life grabbed his 3 loaded guns and some shells and drove from his home in North Carolina and walked through a pizzeria called Comet Ping Pong in Washington, D.C., with the plan that he was going to find the hidden basement where all the children were being kept. And so this is what was known as Pizzagate. And so you see here that for that we have Neptune conjunct the South Node in Pisces. You can see Saturn square the nodes, Saturn's in Sag. And so this idea, which was that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of this pizza parlor, originated in October of 2016. So we would still have similar signature. And this pizza parlor was mentioned repeatedly. And so, and this is all through, 4chan, 8chan, whatever the I guess they're called back channel sources are. But a lot of conspiracy theorists believe that this stuff, like that this pizza parlor was the hub of it. And so they came up with like a code language around it, and folks just got swept in. And so when he discovered that, there was not a basement at all, he surrendered himself to the police. But he would not accept that that the theory was wrong. He just said he got the wrong information. And so since then, this theory has come to encompass a lot more than that. Like it really just like morphs into all different kinds of conspiracy theories. The believers are generally speaking very flexible on what they'll believe on a given day. And over time, Q's posts became increasingly vague and cryptic. And so the reader is kind of able to map their own beliefs onto it. So we get this nebulousness, right? And that projection quality. And so the first posts were these ominous predictions and cryptic riddles. There's some Gemini in there. And there have been thousands of these Q drops, and I don't know if they've stopped completely, but they dropped way off since the election. Questions or comments? Okay. So Conspirituality is actually the name of a rap group from Vancouver that came out in 2009. I don't know that they're still around. But the term is generally known to have been coined in 2011 in a study by 2 sociologists. It was a study called The Emergence of Conspirituality, and it was they used the term to describe the growing overlap between extreme right-wing conspiracy theories and the New Age's desire for spiritual transformation. And it was, well, here's an actual definition. The definition is that it's a rapidly growing movement expressing an ideology fueled by political disillusionment and the polarity of alternative worldviews, where the alt-right and the New Age horseshoe towards each other in a blur of disinformation. And so the study was released, the term was coined in January of 2011, And by March of 2011, Neptune had entered Pisces and the nodes had entered Gemini Sag. But when it was coined, that hadn't quite happened yet. And I think it's also important to just note that this isn't a new thing. We know that especially, the most prominent example of this happening in recent history is during World War II, when Nazis were known to use occult spirituality and practices such as yoga to, this was another rabbit hole I went down, but they did this stuff too. And that's all that I will say about that for now. So at best, the conspirituality movement attacks public health efforts in a time of crisis. At worst, it fronts and recruits the fever dream of QAnon. So let's talk about some of the theories underscoring why and how the New Age movement or the alternative health and wellness world are so susceptible to assuming these ideologies. I mean, at this point in my putting together of the PowerPoint and looking for images and things, I was like, ah! So these are the images I chose for this, which is funny to me. But the New Age movement has a heck of a lot of dissociative spirituality going on, also known as spiritual bypassing. Maybe there's just, we think of that as being a lot of overlap. But, first of all, we are based in a society which, whether or not you participate in the major religions of the world, our society is just kind of steeped in salvationist religions. Christianity is one, Buddhism is another, where like this existence here is painful, suffering, sinful, bad, but it's something to be transcended, right? Like the good stuff comes next. The good stuff comes after you're done with the flesh suit, right? And so there's something that you can do or be that will save you from this, from the suffering. And so part of what we see in evolutionary astrology is that wounds that stem from living in a Christian paradigm where earthly existence is sinful, and that desire to transcend it really do show up very much in the mutable cross, particularly, well, yeah, I would say the whole thing. I was going to say particularly Virgo Pisces, but that's not totally true. And so that can just become a process that's running in the background in a lot of different ways. Again, like the need to transcend, the need to get away from this suffering. And we can look in that in a lot of different frameworks as well, right? Like what colonialization has done, like I was talking about before. But because we're talking about spirituality, that's why I bring that one in. So a basic premise of the New Age is that everything is an illusion. Everything is all good. There are no victims. All judgments are bad. Suffering is an illusion. Right? And again, like these are themes that, you've probably come across. I've probably come across. Some of these things I really had to sit with and be like, well, crap, is that part of my belief system? And like really think about it. So we're talking in generalities here, and there is a lot of nuance, but it is dissociative, right? And that dissociation is a core part of the Neptunian archetype. And so again, it's getting into that, the dissociation of Neptune and Pisces, and then wanting to cling on to beliefs, Sagittarius, that help us to make sense of things, that help us to orient to our experience, and that keep us from having to contact the abyss, which is Pisces. And so in an interview that I saw on Instagram last summer, I have a bibliography at the end of this. There was an interview that Jeff Brown did with Ellen Awalam, and she brought up a few things that really made me think a lot that I'm just going to share now. And she was talking about how one thing we see with dissociative spirituality is that a lot of times it kind of gets mapped back to individuals who had very authoritarian parents, um, or caregivers that were very rigid. And so there's this kind of need for freedom. And there's wounding for lots of reasons, including the suppression of the Aries instinct to be and just exist and learn through experience. And there can also be a lot of fear and shame and other unresolved emotions there. And her point was like, then, for example, when the government comes in and issues a mask mandate, it triggers that repulsion to authority. It triggers that childhood stuff. And there's a replay of the core traumas. Again, just a little example. And so then unresolved issues that have to do with the authoritarian nature of the upbringing kind of collide with the trauma of existing in a pandemic, the cascades of trauma, if you will, and there's that repulsion to something like a mask wearing mandate. And so I guess her point was just, the traumas of authoritarianism in early childhood are part of dissociative spirituality in the first place. One example. But another issue is that when there is a worldwide trauma going on, right? When knowing that it's existing alongside the multitude of other traumas that have been going on for so long. Like reality hits, right? Now here is a mass event that you can't get away from. It's happening to everyone. But when you're dissociated, you are not existing in your body, right? And existence in body is what makes it so that you can actually like accept what's going on and be present with what is. And so it's really hard to come into your body to deal with things during a pandemic, right? Because like, oh crap, that's where the virus happens. It's scary stuff. It's hard to do the healing thing when you're in trauma. So there can be a tendency to want to explain reality away, right? There can be a tendency to want to just come up with reasons why what you're experiencing isn't true. So this is where we can see the Piscean need to latch onto fantasy, to cling onto fantasy, to cling onto something to explain away reality. There's also a core belief that, the mind is more powerful than the body, or that feelings are an illusion, or that the ego is the enemy. And so again, there's just lots of unresolved emotions and a need to not be in the body and need to, keep that separate. We're seeing the kind of, again, the absence of healthy Virgo going on there. So when something emerges that needs this kind of real embodied inquiry, Virgo, it's scary and folks are not equipped to deal with it and they don't have tools. And again, think of, missing the Virgo part of the equation and the somatic processes. And of course, white privilege is everywhere throughout dissociative spirituality as well. And we can just bring that back to something I've already talked about, which is that, South Node Sagittarius, just be more positive. If you would just be more positive, things would be better. Okay, questions there? I see that there's something in the chat. Do you think majority who fell into conspiracy, Pluto and Scorpio generation? No, I don't. Pluto and Scorpio, so we're thinking people born between 85 and 95, 83 and 95-ish. And I actually tend to associate it with folks who are older than that. Do you care to expand more on what you're thinking there, Carla?
Hi, this is the interpreter. Yes, what I was thinking, Carla saying, is the Neptune with Pluto, contrary to Pluto, and I was just wondering about the aspects of those two and the relationship there.
The relationship
With
between
Neptune's transit related to Pluto's, if there's a relation there in all of this.
Probably. I think that, are you talking about like the sextile dynamic between Pluto and Neptune right now?
Yes.
It's something that I haven't thought about, and I think it's probably worth thinking about, but Pluto and Neptune have been sextile for like 100 years. So it would be interesting to see what was going on when they first came into that dynamic and if it carries through.
Okay, thank you.
You are very welcome. Anyone else? Okay. So one of the things that has happened is that we have, you know, the rise of Instagram and social media influencers. And so what's happened is a lot of health and wellness influencers have co-opted conspiracy theories, whether they know it or they don't. And so this is what brings us into QAnon phrases. So getting into the, you know, heavy duty Gemini portion of it. And so these phrases are really important because we're dealing with hashtags, right? So you have a hashtag and then a person clicks on a hashtag. And what happens a lot of times is that you'll find something from a health and wellness influencer and they're using a hashtag. Again, like maybe they know it's QAnon related or maybe they don't, because we're dealing with this kind of changeability of words, changeability of meaning that's indicative of the square between Gemini and Pisces. And then a person starts going down a hashtag rabbit hole, and then they end up getting more and more inflammatory and radical material, right? Because algorithms start feeding you things. And this is how a lot of people end up with just straight out QAnon material at their fingertips, is by following these hashtags. So QAnon has co-opted phrases and hashtags and created new ones that influencers and wellness gurus kind of grab onto. So the real pandemic is fear, right? Fear can be contagious, right? But this is also full of white privilege. This is put out there as a response to COVID. And for many folks, taking precautions is not about fear at all. It's about, you know, not having access to healthcare or wanting to minimize their risk because they don't know enough about the virus, or having chronic health conditions, right? Do your own research is another one. It often ends up in algorithms. Again, like, do your own research. Don't trust me, do your own research. And then they'll start clicking hashtags or just going down rabbit holes and ending up with that increasingly radical material. And that's where we can get into this kind of like, you know, research, learning, Gemini stuff, but then it gets into emotional contagion or cognitive dissonance or overwhelm. Nervous system stuff starts to crop up. Make up your own mind. Again, sounds very reasonable. And this is actually things like that, make up your own mind, do your own research, is actually things that cult leaders will use in their indoctrination processes because it makes them sound very reasonable. 5D is another one. Again, 5D ascension, that stuff's been around for a long time, right? But these are things that have been co-opted. Brainwash doctors, trust your immune system. That's another one that doesn't take inequalities into account. It doesn't take healthcare disparities into account. It doesn't take knowledge of the virus into account, because we actually, like when that one started trending, we didn't know enough about the virus to know that sometimes when people have really amped up immune systems, it's not a good thing for COVID, right? It's assuming access to care. It's assuming access to healthy food. Save the children is a pretty big one. That was hijacking an existing phrase to push their own agenda. And again, if somebody follows that down a rabbit hole, they end up with Q content. Looking at all viewpoints is one that kind of falls in there with do your own research, make up your own mind. It's when used disingenuously, it can put evidence and fantasy on equal footing. It is, oh, where are my notes on this? That was actually a phrase that was used a lot in the debate about intelligent design and teaching intelligent design alongside evolution in science classes. And so that brings us to rhetorical devices, right? And I don't honestly know if I'm using rhetorical devices correctly there, but it made sense in my mind. Always use discernment when it comes to your teachers. So sea lioning is one of the rhetorical devices that is defined as a type of trolling or harassment which consists of pursuing people with persistent requests for evidence or repeated questions while maintaining a pretense of civility and sincerity. It may take the form of incessant bad faith investigations to engage in debate. There's a lot of use of jargon. So jargon is not meant to convey data. It's not made to share perspectives. It's made to establish a symbolic or ritual order where certain questions can no longer be asked. So the users bond over the terms. They bond over the jargon, but not necessarily because they share the same understanding of what the jargon means. The bonding just happens because the terms signal the sharing of emotional contagion. Right? So when I think of a phrase like the real pandemic is fear, right? There's an emotional quality to that one. And so then when people start using it, it allows emotional contagion to kind of take hold. Totalist language is repetitiously centered on all-encompassing jargon, prematurely abstract, highly categorical, relentlessly judging. Logical fallacies. So I just have an example of a logical fallacy, and that is that despite the fact that our Q4 numbers are much lower than usual, we should push forward using the same strategy because our CEO Barbara says this is the best approach. Right? So so for example, like with QAnon, they kept having dates when like the veil would be lifted and we would, Trump would be revealed as the savior and the pedophile ring would be recovered, and they just kept pushing it out. Right? And they would always have a reason for it. Okay. And so one of the things to just kind of keep in mind when it comes to the health and wellness industry is that people are making income off of this stuff. People are making income off of having people click on their link that's hashtag 5D. People are vlogging about this. And actually, the use of video is, the video internet has been around for a while, but the use of video is intense because it allows for intense eye contact, it allows for imagery, it allows for hypnotic musical beats. And so the precognitive or the hypnotic, there's a good Pisces word, amps up, right? Okay. Questions? Are you tracking the mutable cross themes?
I just have like a comment. I think
Yeah.
noticing your historical, like, just like tracking it through the history, it seems like with the mutable cross, if I've got my math right, I mean, it's going to happen like every 4 years. And is that right?
Yeah, my math was every 6, but it might be 4. I was doing 18 divided by 4, so that's 6.
Right. Okay. So, but then it kind of does fall in. It was just interesting to me to note that it kind of fell in election years, or like,
oh yeah.
I don't know if that came up for you, but it was something I noticed.
Cool connection. Yeah, so many interesting patterns in the world. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else? All right. Let's just look at a nice image. I don't know that's relevant to what I'm talking about, but here we are. So why do people believe conspiracy theories? And this is from an article that I have linked at the end of the presentation by Lisa Rankin. Oh my goodness, we only have 15 minutes left. That's going to be fine, just fine. So reality is painful right now, right? People are very vulnerable to being attached to an alternative reality. Conspiracy theories happen, right? Like we depend on whistleblowers and investigative journalists to expose things. And in a lot of ways, people's intuition and gut instincts, Sagittarius, kind of Virgo, I guess, if we bring the gut into it, have been telling them something is wrong. Now, some folks would be like, yeah, something's wrong. Climate change is real, right? Or yeah, something's wrong. Capitalism is collapsing and it's been a horrific nightmare. But not everyone relates in the world to that way. So there's just kind of like the alarm bells going on, or the alarm bells going on down in the gut, right? And they don't know what it is. And so they want to latch on to a belief system that's going to help them understand that, or at least say like, hey, you were right. It's not necessarily paranoid to have suspicions about people in power, right? They lie to us a lot. And we're subject to intense propaganda a lot and unethical marketing, and there's a lack of accountability amongst corporations and so on. Susceptibility to conspiracy thinking is rooted in black and white thinking, so it's all good or all bad. And of course, reality is more nuanced than that. And it's hard for people to deal with nuance or understand that paradoxical things can be true. Right? So like the Catholic Church has issues with pedophilia among its priests, but some priests are good people. Both things can be true. And so then when you bring cults into it, like the fact that a person can be a spiritual guru and a rapist is really hard for people to deal with. And so they'll just cling to one truth, right? They cling to the fantasy. There's the Pisces. When people are hurt, especially within childhood, and they have attachment wounding, there can be a tendency to polarize into immature cognitive processes. There's Gemini. Extreme long-term governmental neglect of our population is a thing. And this makes me think of, like people who in our medical system have known at the intuitive level or because of their symptoms that something is wrong, and they go to the doctor and the doctor's like, you need to eat less. Right? So when people have had their intuition pushed down a lot, it becomes more difficult for them to understand what their intuition is saying to them. Again, that's the Sagittarius wound. We also have a belief or ideology that, we should be able to take care of ourselves. We shouldn't have to rely on government. So again, more cognitive dissonance. And many cults bond over shared beliefs that revolve around a cult leader fighting against some alleged conspiracy. So it's very, good versus evil. So part of what we're facing now is how to reunite our head and our heart, our knowledge and our wisdom, our facts and our intuition. And there's this kind of basic question that arises of, how do I know what's true? Do I trust my gut? Do I trust evidence? Do I trust emotional appeals? And there's a Neptunian disillusionment process that comes as well. And I think that a lot of people are going to be facing as this all shakes out and this square loses its potency. And that's the Neptunian, you know, it is the disillusionment and the existential crisis that comes when the prophecies don't play out, or, you know, the leader doesn't lead. So there's a wake-up call, right? And part of what a guru does is they scare the hell out of a person and then console them. They whip them up into a frenzy and then provide a safe container. All right, so how can we work with this? So when we have a T-square, which is what this is, right? So it's two planets in opposition, in this case, the nodes, which aren't planets. And then those planets in opposition are squaring a planet that creates an apex, right? So Neptune is at the apex of our T-square. So one way of working with a T-square is to think about the energy as shooting out into the opposite, right? So a heady way of saying, we need Virgo. We need Virgo really badly. We've already covered some of the shadow dynamics of Virgo, but it's that kind of actualized, like consciously bringing Virgo in, right? What is discernment? How do I be discerning? How do I look into a teacher's, you know, background to see what they're coming from? Are they talking about their lenses and biases? And the mutable cross itself gives a lot of medicine. Oh, but before I jump ahead of myself, I should also say that with evolutionary astrology, the technique is that you look to the resolution node. So you find the resolution node, because again, when a planet's squaring the nodal axis, we get this flip-flopping thing. Like it's like both the nodes become south nodes. So the resolution node is, if you imagine yourself standing on the planet that's squaring the node, so this would be Neptune, standing on Neptune, staring at the center of the circle, it's the node to the left. So in this case, it would be the south node. Is that right? Have I been visualizing this wrong the whole time? I totally have. I've been thinking it was the north node. Yeah, totally. It's the south node. So it is about going back in. What are my wounds around belief? What are my wounds around intuition? How has my ability to trust myself been wounded? What beliefs do I have in my life now that can help me to orient to this experience? And how do I bring discernment into that process? And then you can look to the ruler of the resolution node, Jupiter, to get more information. So in this case, what does Jupiter in Aquarius bring to the mix? The other piece with Virgo is that it is about bringing in somatic processes, returning to body, healing trauma from a place of presence as much as we can. All right. Kind of moved really quickly over the resolution stuff, but here's a bibliography. The Conspirituality podcast has like 40 episodes at this point. Some of them are really great. I haven't listened to all of them, obviously. Some of them are really great. Some of them are meh. But there's a lot of information there. These books are great too. Here is where you can find me, what I have coming up. So the next thing would be this Saturday. I'm doing a talk through myself, not through PSA, on the archetype of the empath through the zodiac. and other goodies there. I am going to stop share and leave that up just so I can see what's going on in the chat. Curious what the concept of sea lioning is. New term for me. If it's too complicated, then I can Google. Otherwise, open to whatever folks can comment with a summary idea. So it's sea lioning. Excuse me. And you should be able to do a search on it. I found it. I didn't cite my sources with it, but it came up in the discussion of intelligent design. I believe is a rhetorical device. Any other questions or comments? I thought I was going to have time for like 15 minutes worth of questions. Nothing?
I guess I just have a comment that was kind of coming up for me with like talking about why we fall for a conspiracy. It really came to my mind that it's like, along with what you said, also like some sort of nostalgia for when things made sense and try to piece together to make sense again, you know?
Heck yeah.
I feel like that is a lot to do with the generation that is most strongly supporting, especially Trump and all this stuff. Like Fox News is like these people that like the baby boomers or whatever, like when like they had stuff that made sense. And then so that was my comment about that, like some sort of nostalgia for like clarity in the face of like all this new information that we're getting through the internet and all that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that is a basic function of religion, is to help people orient to their experience. And we know that things keep getting weirder and weirder and more intense for the collective. And so I think that's where the, you know, healthy expression of Neptune and Pisces come in, which is compassion, right? Like people are suffering and they're striving to make sense of the world. Now, again, compassion doesn't have to be boundaryless, right? There could still be, there's that discernment piece where like, man, I empathize with you, but also you can't do that, right? But it is, yeah, trying to find a way to make sense of the world. And you're welcome, Thorn. Anything else? Comments, questions, ponderings? Okay. Well, that's all for now. I will stick around for just a minute if anyone has questions that, you know, they're still wanting answered. But thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for learning astrology. See y'all next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Wasn't that fun? Yes. Okay. Yeah. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You too.